Right. Welcome back, everyone, and I hope you've had a fun time in your incubation tanks and in your discovery session earlier. I was just saying that it's been a quick moving day, and appreciate you joining us back for our fireside chat. And Mike behind us has an actual fireplace, so we are truly fireside chatting right now. We wanted to spend a little bit of time, and really just a little bit of time. We have half an hour for a very big topic, but wanted to bring some of the mission of the day and the concepts that we've been talking about around translating this intent around racial justice and putting more resources and effort and energy into it and rolling up our sleeves together into real practical action. And we've got 3 folks with us today who do this work in different ways and shapes and forms every day, who are going to share their own journey and their own work and some of the bright spots that they have seen. So thank you so much for participants for returning, and thank you, Cecily, Ranjini, and Mike for joining us. Since we have a short time, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on bios or introductions. Would love to just start with a question of where you're coming from, your personal journey with this, and why this issue is important to you. And Cecily, I will start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to be here today. Really happy to do this. And, you know, I spent most of my career in the tech sector, most of that time doing corporate responsibility work, but some of it also being the chief diversity officer. And I came to this work, I think, because probably 2 main things. One is I realized there weren't people who looked like me at my level ever. And, you know, that's a lonely place to be when you're in a company of, you know, 10,000+ employees, to not see a lot of representation. But secondly, because I began to realize how incredible the tech sector is as far as a lucrative opportunity, right? Economically. I've been part of companies that went public, more mature, successful companies. I've been seeing what happened around me in Silicon Valley. And I really felt it was important that the representation and the opportunity to participate in that financial and economic gain and opportunity was expanded to more people. And so I think that's a lot of what drove me to kind of start doing work in this field and being more involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you. Ranjini, how about you?
Sure. So thanks again for having us, and welcome to all the participants. I've heard that it's really been a jam-packed day, and I'm glad that we're giving this topic a little bit of time. So I'm joining you from Boston, where I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Next Level Social Impact. So we're a venture philanthropy firm that works with mid-level nonprofits. So we are grant makers. And I come to this work trained as an attorney, but really growing up in nonprofits. So everything from a manager to an external partner to a consultant, and then held a couple of leadership roles, being an executive director. So chief fundraising for nonprofits, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and some racial gaps that exist there. You know, now in the place of being a grant maker and really thinking about what our role is in this work. I take this work very personally because I'm just one generation from poverty. And my parents both grew up in apartheid South Africa, where if you had brown skin, you were not allowed to go to school. There was no public school. And so my dad, through local nonprofits, was able to go to school and excel, and was extremely lucky to be able to have opportunity. And in 1968, won a scholarship to Harvard Medical School. So I am, I think, a living and walking example of how this work that we do for racial justice and social justice can really transform families, transform communities. And, you know, I think the last thing I'll say is I grew up in an affluent town. I was the only person of color in my entire school. So when my first day of 3rd grade, I was called the N-word, and I quickly looked around and I realized I was the only person of color in my entire elementary school. So these issues of race and justice really started early on for me. And so it's been a thread throughout that I bring to my nonprofit work.
Thank you. And Mike? Oh, Mike, you're muted. No, not yet.
Mike, it looks like your audio may have disconnected. So if you'll just use that audio feature in the bottom left, we can get you reconnected.
Are you dialed in, Mike, from a phone? What's the first 3 digits of your phone number? I just realized we can't hear you.
Just say it. 2, 5.
I think you said 619.
That's what I got.
Oh, there we go. This is what we've come to.
Mike, I've merged your audio now.
I see how you treat your guests. I get it. No. Being the only guy on the panel, making it difficult for me. So, just kidding. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the panel. This is a real pleasure to speak today. And you know, I've always done this work off the side of my desk, and now as the head of DE&I for Citizens Bank, I get to do it full time. And while I've only been doing diversity work for the past 5 years, prior to that, I really saw the impact that it can make when I was a managing director doing wealth management or overseeing retail branches from more of a performance standpoint. But, you know, the more I've come to grow and mature over the years in my diversity journey, I realized, you know, as a white man, I've got a lot of privilege that comes with that. But as a gay man, every day I'm fighting for equality, just like many of you are for different aspects. So, you know, as a business leader, I see one side of it, but I also know the impact of having diverse teams and also leading inclusively. And this year, we've certainly seen an acceleration of D&I programs and what it means to the Black and Brown communities at large and some of the systemic issues we deal with now and within politics. So I think if anything, it's just going to increase. And for me, it's just important to help carry that front and center.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. So one of the big questions that I'd love to start with is, one of the things I shared at the top of this event was that we have seen an incredible private sector response to Black Lives Matter this year, largely in response to the high-profile murderings that we saw in the spring and that continue. But in general, companies have been willing to take more of an advocacy role and action role. And one of the criticisms that's emerging is that there's a lot of narrative and a lot of messaging and a lot of verbal support, but not a lot of action being taken. Does that feel true from your perspective? What have you seen and behind the curtain there? And Cecily, I'll start with you again.
Yeah, so I agree. There's a lot of talking, but I think that we should stop and see the value in the profound voices of CEOs who are stepping up to make these pledges and commitments. I mean, we've never seen that before, and they are really leading the way. Many corporate CEOs are doing this. There's still many that aren't. So I think we should applaud the ones that have really stepped up and are making these bold commitments. Secondly, we're seeing commitments made from foundations and corporations of resources, financial resources, at levels we've never seen before. It's unprecedented. We're seeing, you know, I think the last, I haven't added it all up, but I think we're, you know, I saw something like $6 billion plus has been committed. So I think that's incredible. We also are seeing conversations about race and equity happening internally, the dialogues that are starting to happen around these uncomfortable topics, again, that we just haven't seen before. And Mike, you know, probably in his role is leading some of that and seeing more of that than we've seen before. And finally, I think silos are breaking down inside organizations. So for example, one that I've always wanted to break down is the one between corporate social responsibility and the DEI team. And I think there's a lot more collaboration and coming together and working. So those are great things. Where I think we have a lot of work to do is around transparency and accountability. So even though you'll hear a lot of executives talking about goals and we're doing all of these things, I'd like to see what those are. I'd like to see the data. I'd like to see the numbers, right? So I think there needs to be much more transparency and there needs to be accountability. I'd like to know in 6 months, a year, what have you really done? Just to your point, Danielle, like what have they really done? What have they really accomplished? And what haven't they and why? And that's okay, because as you said, we're all on this journey, but I really think it's important that they're more transparent and accountable around the work.
Well, one of the, McKinsey just released a fascinating report on diversity within companies, and they reported that while numbers are looking better, there is one of the largest challenges is leadership accountability, and one of the largest challenges is inclusion. Once you have a diverse workforce, really retaining them and making that part of your culture and having them feed the culture themselves. And Ranjini, Mike, anything that you would add to that of high-level corporate accountability?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think it's a little too early to gauge our progress, certainly with the everything that's happened this year, because we all know that, systemic change happens very slowly, and you're not only dealing with policy changes, you're dealing with wealth, you're dealing with power, institutions, values, fear, so it's, fear of risk, fear of lawsuits, fear of shareholders. But I really see a lot of benefits that are outweighing some of those risks. And as Cecily mentioned, we're beginning to see more companies being more transparent in their reporting of their demographic data. And for, people who are like job seekers, certainly regulatory agencies and our customers are demanding it. And I would also say, it's topics that we would have never considered about talking about racism, privilege, and power in the workplace has become, common stance today. And we're actually, developing even strategies on what do we do after the election? If there's a big uprising, how do we deal with this as managers and employees and deal with conflict? So, this conversation continues. It'll be really interesting, 6 months, a year from now, if this momentum continues. I certainly hope so.
I think the one thing there from the nonprofit perspective too is, I think first we do have to start with conversation, and then it has to lead to accountability. But I also think that we often think about these initiatives as separate from the actual work that we're doing. So we're going to say, we're going to track these things separately. And to some extent we have to, because we have to start looking at data, and we have to start.
Ranjini, you're frozen. Can you still hear us? The world of first.
I saw something the other day, Danielle. It said Zoom calls are like seances, because you're like, hello, are you there? Are you out there? Signal,
I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
I'm completely ill-equipped for it. But while we're getting her back, I want to hit on, Mike, one of the points that you talked about, which is the training and the conversations that are happening within companies, right? And one of the things that we discussed on our call when we were prepping for this is how so much of this starts with the individual. We're talking about systemic change. We're talking about shifting the cultures of institutions, but at the end of the day, they're comprised of individuals. And just in the fact that, folks coming together today, individual actors can inform real change. There are leaders within institutions who are, without ill intent, are perpetuating harmful systems, are not aware of their own blind spots, and are continuing cultures that exclude and decrease diversity. And so I would love to hear your perspective on how we get those leaders past their own blind spots, what successes you've seen there.
Yeah, I guess a couple of thoughts. Blind spots are created in a number of ways. You've got leaders who are unaware and or ill-equipped to take action. You've got some that aren't affected by inequitable practices. They don't see diversity, equity, inclusion tied to even a business imperative for them, or they just don't care, right? So I think some of the ways you can address these, companies in particular, or executive leadership, you've got to be really intentional in your actions. I know here at Citizens, we've instituted several different strategies to address some of these issues. We did an overall audit of our DE&I program Korn Ferry was the company that we used for the past 10 months. And, they pulled apart everything from, policies, procedures, pay equity, how we're hiring, who's walking out the door, executive interviews, you name it. And it was great. It really either affirmed what we were doing or what we need to get on our radar screen, and then how we do that. The other approach we've taken is to increase accountability and transparency. We created a really holistic D&I scorecard. And what's really great about it is it has very targeted and specific gaps, specific to, for example, developing women and people of color into some of our leadership roles. That's where we have some opportunity. We're looking at emerging talent. Do they have fully exercised development plans versus, hey, this is nice to do, but actually doing it. Supplier diversity is another big focus for us. And I would say, colleague engagement scores. So that's all part of that scorecard. Two other things would be, we are increasing our diverse interview slate. Before we had to have at least a woman and a person of color as part of the interview process. Now 50% of that slate from our feeder pools to our leadership roles have to be diverse individuals. And then the last thing is we didn't have a really robust learning strategy around D&I. So we did a bake-off of several different vendors and chose one that will really help us segment, what's the learning journeys that we want to put out there by position, role specific, and deliver them in such a way that, people can overcome their blind spots and, it all kind of puzzle pieces together.
And I would add, Danielle, that for those people, those leaders who still don't get it after all of that, right? Who are still wondering, like, why are we doing this? And this doesn't affect the bottom line for me. I think companies then need to use a more mandatory approach, which is really around tying compensation to the achievement of those goals, because it's a business strategy and you tie other things to that's important, this as well.
Ranjini, welcome back.
Thank you. I didn't mean to drop the mic at the end of that last statement, guys. I think the snow in Boston today was a little unexpected and might be messing with my internet.
There's tropical storms and snow we're dealing with here.
Right, exactly. I think in nonprofits as it relates to leadership, there more and more recently in nonprofits, we've been tracking leaders of color, our diversity at the leadership level. But I think we have to evolve also to be thinking about the pipeline of leaders and making sure that we're actually developing leaders who bring diverse perspectives from the director, from the manager level. That's not something we've always been good at nonprofits, because often we don't have large career ladders, and it's something we think about a lot. So I think that while we have done work and, making sure that we are looking at leaders of color and making sure that there are more and more opportunities, especially in Boston, there have been some wonderful leaders in this area. We do have room to grow, not only on that, but also making sure that we are promoting and creating a pipeline of leaders.
Yeah,
well, I think oh, go ahead, Cecily.
No, I just add one thing. So one thing that I get to do now is I work with Presidio Graduate School, and I also am on the Net Impact Board. And both organizations are focused on the next generation of leaders in the sustainability and social impact space. And somebody asked me the other day, like, what are you hearing from this group of people and around DEI? And what I'm hearing is that there's a sense of urgency, right? They're expecting organizations to already be at this place. And I spend a lot of time coaching, to kind of reset their expectations so that when they come into the workplace, they realize that we're on this journey. But their demographic looks more diverse, and they're expecting to go work in places that look that way. So I think there's an urgency around doing this. Also, if we want to attract this next generation of employee to our employee base, we sort of have to meet them a little bit more where they are too. And that's becoming even, I think even more apparent now.
Well, and I know we've been talking about this mostly from the corporate side, but that what I'm hearing from both of you is that it's true across sector, right? It's just an institutional societal need right now. And I think the nonprofit sector often gets off the hook, right? Because we are closer to the front lines of this, or perceived to be closer to the front lines of this, but the nonprofit sector has as deep a diversity issue as the corporate sector, and particularly with large nonprofits, most boards and most leadership are still white men. And even at smaller organizations, most leaders are still white women. And so talk to me a little bit about that. What have you seen with your partners within the sector? I know, Ranjini, you have an up-close look at this from your past and your current role. Are you seeing different and new strategies in the nonprofit sector on this?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right in that the nonprofit sector has gotten off the hook a little bit on this because we are closer to the front lines of doing racial justice work and social justice work. But I think it's an area where we are holding up a mirror a little bit more and more. And I think in recent months, we've been doing it even more, which is a good thing. I think that when you think about how nonprofits run, we are funded by grant makers, or we're funded by government, which is the largest nonprofit really, in the United States. And so when we think about how do we measure where we are literally putting our money and giving, these nonprofits who we see as the most capable of success, we've been doing a lot of work in reflecting on ourselves and who are we giving money to? So for example, 69% of white-led organizations have 3 months or more of cash on hand. And so that's how you kind of, in the nonprofit world, that's kind of how you measure your financial sustainability, making sure that you're not just living month to month, that you've got a few months of cash on hand. So 69% of white-led. That number drops to less than 25% for Black-led organizations and BIPOC-led organizations. So we really have to take a hard look at and say, well, what does this actually say about our level of really putting our money where our mouth is, and that we are going to fund these types of nonprofits. I think the other thing as well is, and I alluded to this earlier, I can't tell you the number of times where I previously have done political work, and I never thought I would be a card-carrying lobbyist, but I found myself up on Beacon Hill being a lobbyist and proud to be one. But I can't tell you the amount of times where I looked around and I was the only person of color in the room. And you think of Boston. I don't know why that was so shocking to me, but it was, and it was not just something that happened rarely. It was something that happened often. And so there's this, that we can look at the data, but then there's also these anecdotal things that leaders of color will tell you just happen to them all the time. I happened to be on a webinar earlier this week where there was an executive director who took a meeting, and they asked, when's the executive director going to come? I thought we were going to meet with the executive director. And she said, I am the executive director. So I think nonprofits, we maybe have started talking about these issues a little bit sooner, but there is still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I would add also from a corporate funding perspective. So when I was a funder, and I would imagine this is definitely the case now with respect to equity and racial justice issues, I look to my nonprofit partners as the experts and the people who are in touch with the constituency that I'm trying to reach. So if right now my focus is going to be on, racial equity and social justice, which so many organizations are pledging and making commitments to, I think they are expecting that the nonprofits they work with are made up of diverse people at all levels. And so I think that nonprofits need to rise to that occasion too, because I think funders are going to be looking for more of that as well, as you just said, right? Mm-hmm. But I think from the corporate side, funders are going to be expecting that also.
Yeah. And I would just add, when you think of, I guess if there's any positive change coming out of the tragic events of this year is the outpouring of financial support for Black nonprofits. I know for us, as part of our additional $10 million investment over the next couple of years, we really wanted to align ourselves with nonprofits in our markets where our colleagues could, provide that human capital as well. The Posse Foundation, 100 Black Men, NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, to name a few. But it's really, in the end of it, it's not about cutting a check and walking away. I think we're a little late, we were late in our messaging, getting out on which organizations we were going to contribute to, because we were really specific on which ones we chose, and we got a little heat for that. But I think in the end, what are we trying to accomplish? It's wealth creation, whatever that looks like for these groups, access to capital, products and services that support them. So you have to think through that. But I'm hoping this year we saw that injection of capital to some of these groups, and then aligning them to your business, your values. I'm hoping that made a big difference to make up for some of the white-led organizations that seem to be the money makers in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have such a discerning employee and consumer base right now that if your messages and your narrative don't align with your business practice and your actions, that they're going to pick up on that quickly.
Yeah.
So we have a group, 150 plus folks on this call who are mission oriented with us, right? They are with us in terms of this is a problem and we need to do something about it. What would you share with them? What action would you have them take?
So I can kick it off. I would say that keep it simple, right? So I think it is important to tie actions to your mission and to your and to what you're delivering, and to set goals, but to keep it simple and to make sure, as you just said, Danielle, that those actions that you are doing and announcing externally are aligning with what you are really doing internally. So at a very high level, that would be some guidance that I would make. I think it is very important that people do set a strategy, and organizations, all kinds, set strategies and make real goals that can be measured around talent, around inclusive culture, around their value chains, and around how publicly they're going to show up as thought leaders and advocacy work that they're going to do. So that's kind of the framing that I would advise.
I think for me, going back to something that Mike said, is start at the beginning. So when you think about systemic inequity, when you think about systems and how they start. So when Mike says, when we build talent pools, we need to make sure that we're thinking about that from the very beginning, and we're not at the end, thinking about, well, why don't we have such a diverse workforce? It really starts with on the hiring front. And so I think really starting at the beginning and having that front of mind. So we're building diverse candidate pools, but then also that we are making sure that we are bringing in inclusive perspectives from the very beginning. So I know that I said this before when I was talking to you all, but for me, these initiatives, aren't necessarily about the color of your skin or your gender or other things that you can label yourself with, but the richness of DEI work is to bring in different perspectives, and that's what makes our decisions stronger, and that's what actually makes nonprofits or companies, any organization, stronger, is by bringing in inclusive perspective. So I would just say that doing that at the beginning is really important.
Yeah, and I would just add I've had the opportunity now to create 3 DE&I programs from scratch in many ways. And if you're going to integrate equity practices into whether it's a nonprofit or a corporation, a couple things. Go in, take inventory of all your human capital processes, recruiting, pay equity, benefits, compensation, talent development, education, the whole litany. I mean, I just put them on a spreadsheet and then list out all the practices and policies and procedures where you want to see DE&I embedded, and then simply put a check mark next to the ones, which ones are we doing today, which ones are we kind of partially doing, and which ones aren't on the radar at all. And what that does, it gives you a starting roadmap. And then, once you've got your list laid out, just determine what's the impact of each one, what are the resources I'm going to need, and then you can figure out the sequencing. And it's proven for me to provide a really nice roadmap of the things that will actually change the practices and policies that will affect everybody, not just certain communities.